It is an inflection point for the Indian economy with the IMF warning of a global recession. Institutions like the RBI will be looked upon at this moment to stabilize the economy and for much more hand-holding. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our newsmaker on the program today is someone who takes us today inside the working of the RBI, one of the most critical and important autonomous institutions of the country. He should know he's been a governor of the RBI and he's had a 15-year-long relationship with the central bank. Amid debates over how much autonomy the RBI actually enjoys, what the RBI has in mind when it talks about a digital rupee, is India really headed for a crisis that it is underestimated? And so much more. Dr. C. Rangarajan's book that talks about the multiple forks in the road, roads that he could have taken, roads that he did travel, and roads that he did not travel, is an essential reading for our time. Let's introduce our newsmaker on the program today. I'm very pleased to welcome on the program Dr. Rangarajan, whose book, as I said, just out, just published, is an essential reading. And Dr. Rangarajan, it's great to see you. One of the things that I was struck by while I was reading your book, whether it's about the actual value of the rupee, the functioning of the RBI, the banking sector, reforms, is how certain issues, even decades later, seem to have contemporary resonance. So really, it is great reading. Let me start by asking you, if I may, before we get into the book, for your overall sense of the economy today, sir.
Well, the Indian economy is still to recover from the impact of COVID-19. People thought that the current year, 22-23, would be a normal year. But that hope was shattered with the Russian-Ukraine war. Therefore, added to the complications brought about by COVID-19, we also have to face the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war. Therefore, the getting back to normal during the current year has been somewhat disrupted by these developments. What has really happened is, in the year 2021, the Indian economy went down because of lockdown restrictions. Then the economy picked up in the next year. Therefore, at the beginning of the year, we were exactly where we were 2 years ago, or back to the situation at the end of 1920. Therefore, this would have been a normal year where the economy would have picked up. But as circumstances have changed, perhaps the rate of growth of the Indian economy during the current year would be perhaps a little below 7%. That is the estimate many people have given. I had argued even much earlier that the expectation of a strong pickup during the current year was not possible.
Not likely, yes.
Yeah, unlikely. And therefore, we are probably going to get a growth rate which is less than 7%. Some people may think that a growth rate of even 6.5 or 6.8 is a good growth rate. Normally, it would be, but in the current situation where we are essentially back to where we were at the end of 3 years ago, this is the rate of growth could have been much higher. Because if you look at the forecast for this year, in Q3 and Q4 of the current fiscal, the rate of growth is expected to be only about 4.1% or 4.2%. That is not a good growth over a normal base. So what we really need to do, what is really critical to my thinking, is that the crucial year is going to be the next year, 23-24. If you really want to push the economy up, it should be seen in 23-24. And that's the rate of growth of close to 7% in 23-24. will mean we are back on a reasonably high growth path.
So I want to pick up from your book something that really struck me as being in the headlines today, and obviously in the headlines as you tell it all those many years ago. And that is the actual value of the rupee. In your book, you talk about how the RBI had to make what you call the downward adjustment of the rupee, and how you actually had to, you apprehended that there would be political pushback to this. Now, this is a very relevant chapter, especially in the light of the debate around the rupee today. You have seen Finance Minister Sitharaman's comments. The rupee isn't weakening, the dollar is strengthening. So before I come to this debate in the present context, talk a little bit about why and how there's always political pushback when institutions like the RBI, economists like yourselves, actually argue for the rupee to find its own level.
Well, in one sense, when we move to the market-determined exchange rate system in the early 1990s as part of the reform, our hope was that the normal market forces will determine what the exchange rate of the rupee will be, because that reflects a supply and demand for foreign currency, and therefore that would be the natural rate of the value of the rupee. But what is happening is that some decades ago, almost, the external value of a currency was almost determined by the internal value of the currency. That is what is called the purchasing power parity theory, which meant that if the rate of inflation in country A is higher than the rate of inflation in country B, then the value of the currency of country A, where inflation is higher, will lose. That is the old theory. But now what is happening is, it is not the current account, which I mean export of goods and services and import of goods and services, which go to determine the exchange rate of the rupee. A new entry into the picture is the capital inflows. When capital inflows come into the country, then that is over and above what is happening because of the current account deficit. So a country A, or like country India, may be having a current account deficit, which we have been having for many years. But the capital inflows which come in really supply the dollar, supply the foreign currency. And therefore, the rate of the value of the rupee is not determined exclusively by the current account deficit. Now, the key factor playing a role is the capital inflows. When capital inflows come, the value of the currency gets strengthened. When capital flows go out, then the value of the currency comes down. So in some sense, what is happening today in the last few months or in the last few weeks is the outflow of capital. That is actually pulling the currency down. Yes. Because the factors in the home country are more favorable because the rate of interest has gone up there, or because of other factors. When foreign investors, particularly portfolio investors, sell their shares here and convert the rupees back into dollar, then there is a demand for dollar that comes because of the capital outflows, and that is what is really happening.
Do you agree? Do you agree with
in that sense?
Yes. Do you agree with the government's present response to the plummeting rupee against the dollar? Because, in your time at the RBI too, while Dr. Manmohan Singh, as you said, was supportive, there's always a fear of a political resistance. It's not easy for politicians to just sit back and watch the rupee fall. They have to explain it to the public. Do you agree today with Finance Minister Sitharaman's statement on the rupee, saying it's the dollar that's strengthening, not the rupee that's weakening?
No, the point that I am making is that the value of the rupee today is being determined by the capital inflows and outflows. The factors influencing capital inflows and outflows are external factors as well as domestic factors. It is not as if that domestic factors are excluded from it. If, for example, the current account deficit goes up, then naturally that will also influence the value of the rupee. So you can't put it entirely on what is happening outside. But the fact is that at the present moment, the sudden decline, when there is a steady decline, you can attribute it more to the domestic factors. When there is a sudden decline, it happens because of the external factors. Therefore, but I would still say that two things are relevant. I think we should not overlook it in trying to manage the value of the rupee. One is a level of the current account deficit, and the other, the rate of inflation domestically versus externally. These are critical, and these are matters on which the role of the domestic authorities is extremely important. Therefore, you cannot get away from the fact that we need to manage it. We not manage the value of the rupee directly. We need to manage the economy in such a way. The current account deficit is as low as possible, and the rate of inflation domestically is not higher than elsewhere. I think both these things are critically important in managing the value of the rupee.
And do you believe that's happening? What would you be advising the government to do if you could?
Because the point really is that we really, for example, in controlling inflation, it is important. I mean, really growth is important. Inflation, control of inflation is also important. But at some particular point, one takes precedence over the other. Therefore, we cannot now say that when we are at around about 7.4% inflation, consumer price inflation, we really have to say, yes, one of our major objectives now will be to control inflation. So the control of inflation must get the due recognition.
Yes, that's an important way to understand what's happening with the rupee and where government intervention may domestically be possible. Before I look at other issues in the present, I want you to take us back to those, as the book also calls them, the crisis years, when you were actually in a situation where India had to ship gold. I was fascinated to read in your book for, I think, just about $400 million, which, as you say, sounds so small, like such a paltry amount today. But these were really the crisis years. This was, about pledging gold. This ushered in liberalization eventually, but not before the crisis. So talk a little bit about that time when even selling real estate assets, including an embassy in Tokyo, was considered, didn't happen eventually, as your book tells us. But just the shipping of gold and the kind of things you had to check, you had to get customs involved. I mean, it all sounds, straight out of a fiction movie, except it all happened.
Yes, I think that was a difficult decision. I mean, the attachment to gold is very much so in India. And in fact, I would say it is the shipping of the gold that brought home to the people of the country the critical nature of the situation. That is when they realized that we are caught in a difficult situation and we really need to do something fundamentally to change the system so that this kind of a crisis does not recur. As I have written, there are very many problems involved in shipping gold. After all, we were willing to pledge gold, but then the central banks, the other central banks, the two of them insisted that the gold must come out of the country. So that is why we had to ship. Even though we can say that we are segregating and keeping it as a pledge against the loan, they wanted the gold to be shipped. And that is why we had to enter into a whole series of actions to ship the gold. Actually, there were, as you said, if you read it, there are many difficulties in sending out that gold because all gold was not London delivery clear, and therefore we had to even send it there and melt it and give it to them and so on. And the trauma of sending it through a plane. Just imagine what happens if that plane falls or something. I mean, I don't know. I mean, any kind of tragedy can happen. Then it would be impossible to live with that. But we went through it and we did send it. But then the most important thing is that we were able to get it back very, very soon. I think one important point that I want to make here is that our response to the balance of payments crisis at that time was exactly the opposite of what we used to do before. Previously, whenever we had a balance of payments crisis, we will tighten the imports. We will see that much less is imported and so on and so forth. But for the first time, taking this occasion, we moved away from a policy of import substitution and moved towards embracing world trade and becoming a competitor in the world trade. That is the big change that happened.
Eventually, eventually that crisis led to the opening up of the Indian economy. But when you look back at those years, what was the thing that kept you up at night? You know, there was, of course, as you said, my God, what if the gold doesn't reach when it's supposed to? What if we lose this gold? But other than that, what kept you up at night, Dr. Rangarajan, in those crisis years when the balance of payments crisis was unfolding and India was approaching the IMF for money, pledging gold, thinking of selling real estate assets?
Well, the other major action at that particular point of time was the devaluation of the rupee. As you know, that the word devaluation is associated with some kind of a stigma in the country because the earlier devaluation in 1966 did not go through well, and people always regard devaluation as something that should be avoided, kind of a thing. But then we had to take, I think the new government took this decision. This was one of the earliest decisions took by the new government. As you
the Chandrasekhar government, yes.
Yeah, as you would have seen in the book, we did it in 2 stages. And in a sense, the first devaluation was done in order to, you may say, test the water, test how it goes. But then we knew that we had to do a considerable amount of devaluation, and then we took the second decision. Therefore, there was a considerable amount of anxiety at that time.
I can imagine.
People were really thinking, where will the rupee go? Because once we did the first and followed it by second, and people were not sure that we are not following it up by a third. We had to reassure the people that this is the end of the story. We are not going again into a devaluation. Otherwise, if people expect further devaluation, then exporters will will not get back the money soon. They will wait for some more time and then only get the dollar converted into rupee. So that was another moment.
Well, it was certainly a historical inflection point that led to the liberalization and the reforms that followed. One of the other things I want to ask you about, Dr. Rangarajan, is your book, of course, talks about the RBI and the banking sector. Now, this has continued to be a major controversy through modern times as well. You would know that one of your successors to the post, Rangarajan, there was a lot of media attention, on his utterances when it came to willful defaulters. More recently, Mr. Chidambaram, who's been former finance minister, went on social media to talk about the merger of bad banks with stronger banks because you didn't want to let any bank fall or sink at that time. How do you look at this debate around bad banks, bad loans, willful defaulters? And looking back, do you believe that a parachute should have been given to the banks as it was in your time and even later? Or do you think these banks should have been, in a way, allowed to sink? And in that sense, that would have been a more just outcome of the kind of bad loans that we have seen given, not always for financial reasons, but for political reasons.
Well, in the early part of 1990s, we were more concerned with introducing reforms, which will go to strengthen banks. And therefore, there were 2 or 3 aspects that we worked on at that particular time. One was to introduce what we call the prudential norms for the banking system, like capital adequacy, provisioning, recognition of income, and so on and so forth. So that was a way in which to make the bank sound. And the other was to introduce a bit of competition in the system. We allowed, after a long time, private sector banks to be set up, and that was. And also another thing, in the case of the public sector banks, we allowed the ownership of the government to come down from 100 to 51%. Yeah. 51% meant that they will still be the major owner. But the very fact that we allowed the injection of the private segment into the public sector banks was also expected to improve efficiency. And thirdly, we went on supervision. The Board for Financial Supervision was set up, and so on. So our actions were directed towards making the banking system inherently strong and powerful. So that is what it. But then the question is, does that ensure that there will be nothing going wrong with the banking system? What has really happened subsequently is that there have been, while if you look at it and look at the numbers, the ratio of non-performing assets came down steadily after that. Then it picked up a little later, and we had a problem. But then there are 2 kinds of defaults. One is willful default, and the other is the default because of the change in the circumstances. For example, when the economy, after booming between 2005-06 to 2010-11, started slipping, what happened was that some of the projects which had been sanctioned earlier turned out to be non-viable. Yes. So what was considered to be viable under a particular set of circumstances became unviable because of the change in the environment. Therefore, some part of the non-performing assets which emerged is also due to the change in the circumstances, both internal and external, and so on. So I can list a few more things. But the point really is, what we really need to avoid is this willful default. I mean, there is the banking system will have to take some risk always. But the point is that the due process and procedure in granting the loan must be followed. I think otherwise, that is where the critical point comes in. We have built safeguards into the system, but sometimes it fails, and we have to be very careful on that.
And yes, of course, this is something that is now, of course, also in the Supreme Court, before the court, willful defaulters, as you mentioned. Finally, Dr. Rangarajan, you do speak about the autonomy of the RBI, the legislation that actually mandates this, and the relationship between the government of the day and the RBI governor. I want to ask you, we have seen in recent years some high voltage clashes. Dr. Rangarajan is key among them. He didn't get a second term because he didn't get along, as it were, with the government of the day. I'm sure you had some of your own run-ins, though you allude only to one disagreement with P. Chidambaram. How autonomous is the RBI according to you? And how autonomous is the RBI governor?
Well, the problem arises in how to resolve the differences between what RBI thinks and what the government thinks. After all, RBI has been set up as an independent institution because it can exercise freedom of action on certain matters. And that is the whole purpose of creating RBI as a separate institution. You may recall that when the Reserve Bank of India was being set up, the question was asked why it should be in Bombay. At that time, the argument was that this institution should be as far away from government as possible. And it may look a little odd, but this is one of the arguments used at that time, that even physically it should not be at the same place. So that is, in some sense, that indicates the attitude that was taken at that time and the expected character of the central bank. But obviously, the management of the economy is also the responsibility of the government.
Yes.
And in the management of the economy, there are key issues with which the Reserve Bank is also involved. Therefore, the point really is that there can be, and there will always be differences between RBI and the government. Two things can be done in this. One is allocate some responsibilities, or shall we say, give a mandate to the Reserve Bank regarding what has to be done. One good example is the inflation targeting. A legislation was passed saying that the Reserve Bank will be responsible for maintaining inflation within certain bounds, 4% plus or minus 2%.
Yeah.
So that becomes a responsibility of the Reserve Bank. And then what we call in the lexicon of economists, this is operational independence. This operational independence should be given to the Reserve Bank. Once that has been given, then the government should not interfere with it. While giving the mandate, whether it is 4% plus or minus 2% or something else, the government has a role, because it is also passed through the legislation. It goes through the parliament. Therefore, ceding certain powers to the Reserve Bank and giving it the responsibility to take care of it is one way of resolving the problem.
What do you remember as your biggest disagreement with the government of the day?
Well, the most important achievement was that until 1992, the fiscal deficit of the government of India was getting monetized. There was an agreement between the RBI and the government, which enabled the government in a way to monetize its fiscal deficit. This, in a way, undercuts the role of the Reserve Bank, the importance of the Reserve Bank. So I made a speech in Calcutta on this, and then took it up with the then finance minister. But we found such a favorable response from the finance minister that we rewrote the agreement. We, first of all, limited the extent of monetization. Later on, we revoked the agreement itself and said that the government will be entitled only to ways and means advances and not the monetization of the fiscal deficit through the system of
that was an independence you were able to carve out for the RBI. But you write in the book about how you and Mr. Chidambaram spoke almost daily at one point. He had very strong opinions. You didn't always agree. What did you clash the most over?
Well, in some sense, I should tell you, the period in which I was governor was a period of crisis.
Yes.
See, we were coming out of an important crisis, and we could not afford the luxury of a fight between the governor and the government. I think that apart, I still hold the view. RBI has its importance, has its own responsibilities, and it should stand by what it thinks is appropriate in those cases. For example, like supervision over banks. Whether the bank is a public sector bank or is a private sector bank, there should be no distinction. And the authority of the RBI in supervising both these institutions must be the same. And the RBI should be willing to take whatever action it thinks it is necessary to do it. Therefore, the only other thing is there must be some way of resolving issues. I mean, I think the issues and problems will arise. And there must be some respect for the autonomy of the Reserve Bank of India and work within that kind of a framework so that problems are resolved. Therefore, everywhere in the world, there are differences, but it should be resolved.
Well, I think the United Kingdom is a good example of what autonomous banks can actually do, going head to head with with very contentious tax concessions to the rich that subsequently had to be taken back. Thank you, Dr. Rangarajan. Your memoir is a ringside view of history, some of the most critical years, the crisis years of India, and how India emerged from them. But a lot else to unpack in the book, including the autonomy of the RBI, the relationship with cleaning up the banking sector, and much more. Thank you very much, sir. Pleasure talking to you. Take care.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.